The message came in at 0400 ship time, on a frequency nobody used anymore. Ensign Kofi Boateng almost missed it. He was 3 hours into a 6-hour comms watch aboard the Halcyon Reach, half asleep with his chin propped on his fist, running through the numbers for the wedding leave he'd requested. His sister was getting married in November. He had told her he'd be there. He had told her twice, actually, because the first time she hadn't believed him. Not after the last 2 leaves he'd had to cancel, once for a quarantine relay and once for an engine fire that had eaten 4 days he'd never gotten back. This time he'd put it in writing. This time he meant it. He was 3 months out from that wedding, running the arithmetic of duty rotations and jump schedules for the 4th time that week, when the old distress band lit up, and his hand moved before his brain caught up. "Captain," he said, sitting up so fast his chair creaked. "I've got a signal. It's not one of ours." Captain Elena Voss didn't look up from the requisition forms she'd been fighting with for 20 minutes, forms that wanted her to justify, in triplicate, why the Halcyon Reach had used more medical foam on its last 3 colony runs than the previous crew had used in a full year. The Halcyon Reach was a relief corvette, not a warship, 60 meters of medical bays, cargo holds, and patched-together engine housing, built to carry vaccines and water purifiers to colony worlds that couldn't afford their own ships or their own doctors. Paperwork was the real enemy out here, not pirates. Pirates, at least, had the decency to be quick about it. "Define not ours," she said, still not looking up. Vantrel distress code. Old format, the kind they stopped using years back, before the newer encryption protocols. It's coming from a mining rig, designation Outpost 61, out past the debris belt. No response to hails on any channel. Signal's weak and it's looping the same burst over and over, like whoever set it running didn't have time to check it was working properly before they had to go do something else. That got her attention. She set the tablet down. The Vantrel Compact didn't share space willingly. Their ships kept a wide, deliberate distance from human vessels, like 2 dogs that had agreed, without ever discussing it, to walk on opposite sides of the street. In 4 years of running this stretch of the frontier, Voss had spoken to exactly 1 Vantrel official, for exactly 90 seconds, about a shipping lane dispute neither side wanted to escalate into anything more than a terse exchange of coordinates. The Compact didn't ask for help. As far as Voss had ever been able to tell, the Compact didn't believe in the concept. "Show me," she said. Kofi threw the readout to the main display. A rig, half swallowed by the shadow of a dead asteroid, venting something that glowed faintly orange in the ship sensors. Not fire, not quite, but something close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter much. Heat signature spreading unevenly across 3 decks. Structural failure, by the look of the pattern, not an attack. Nobody had done this to them. It had simply happened, the way things eventually happen to equipment nobody has the budget to replace. "How many life signs?" Voss asked. "Reading's bad this far out, and it's getting worse the longer that reactor keeps venting. Could be a dozen. Could be 40. I can't get a clean count until we are closer." Priya Nandan, the ship's engineer, had wandered onto the bridge holding a mug of something that had stopped being coffee an hour ago and had achieved a kind of tar-like permanence instead. She looked at the display, then at the captain, then said the thing everyone on the bridge was already thinking and nobody wanted to be the one to say first. "That's not our jurisdiction. That's not even our alliance. We answer that, and best case, the Compact tells us to mind our business and files a complaint about airspace. Worst case, they decide we are snooping around a mining operation we have no business being near, and it turns into an incident that gets written up somewhere with our names on it." "Worst case," Voss said, "there are people dying on that rig and nobody's coming for them." "We don't even know if they're people the Compact would send anyone for," Priya said, not unkindly, just tired, the way a person points out a fact they wish weren't true. "You know how they run things over there. Not everybody out there counts the same to them. Never has." Voss was already standing. Priya set her mug down on the console, hard enough that it rang, and looked at the captain a beat longer, as if weighing whether the objection was worth repeating a second time. It wasn't, and she knew it wasn't, and something in her shoulders settled into the particular resignation of an engineer who has already started running fuel calculations in her head before her captain has finished giving the order. "Set a course," Voss said. "Kofi, keep hailing them on every band we've got, in case somebody's listening who isn't supposed to be, or somebody who can't answer yet still hears it and knows help's coming. Priya, get Reyes up. Tell him to open the medical bay and start pulling stock, burns, smoke inhalation, and radiation kit, in that order." Kofi hesitated only a second before his hands moved over the console. He thought, not for the first time, that this was exactly the kind of decision his sister would have loved to hear about at the wedding, told over the good champagne, everyone leaning in, and exactly the kind of decision that might mean he wasn't at the wedding at all to tell it. He sent the course change anyway. What none of them noticed, because there was no reason to notice it, because it looked like nothing more than a dead chunk of rock among 1,000 other dead chunks of rock, was the relay buoy drifting 8,000 kilometers off their bow, matching their new heading with the patient, silent precision of something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment to arrive. 6 hours later, the Halcyon Reach came alongside Outpost 61, and Olenivos finally understood why nobody had come. The rig was a mining platform, old even by frontier standards, clinging to a scarred asteroid that had been eaten hollow from the inside over what looked like decades of continuous operation. Half its hull plating had buckled outward in a slow-motion structural collapse, the kind that happens not in one dramatic instant but across days of neglected stress fractures finally giving way. Whatever had triggered it, a reactor stress fracture, from the readings, aggravated by heat cycling that should have been caught and repaired long before it got this bad, had been going on for the better part of a week, not hours. This wasn't a sudden accident. This was a wound that had been left open and untreated until it became a crisis nobody could pretend not to notice anymore. "I've got a head count," Kofi said, voice tight, scrolling through a scan that kept resolving new details the longer it ran. 51. Vantrel, all of them. Mixed ages. There are children in there, Captain. At least 6, maybe more. The smaller signatures are hard to separate from background. On a mining rig. Family housings built into the lower decks. Looks like whole households live out here, not just shift workers rotating in and out. This isn't a work camp. It's a settlement that happens to also be a mine. Dr. Omar Reyes leaned over Kofi's shoulder, frowning at the scan, already running mental triage before he'd even set foot aboard. Radiation's climbing in 3 compartments and it's not slowing down. If that reactor goes, it's not going to be a fire we can put out. It's going to be a hole where the rig used to be, and everything inside a couple hundred meters of it goes with it. Voss opened a channel, broadcasting on every frequency the rig might still be able to receive, old and new, in case whoever was left aboard didn't have working comms on the systems they were used to. Outpost 61, this is the medical relief vessel Halcyon Reach. We have you on sensors and we are prepared to render assistance. Please respond. Static. Long enough that Voss started to wonder if there was anyone left to answer. Then, faint and cracked, a voice, accented in the clipped, layered way the Vantrel spoke trade common, like every word had to pass through a committee before it was allowed out. You should not be here. A pause, breathing, something that might have been pain held very carefully at bay. This designation is not rated for outside contact. Compact vessels are already en route. Are they? Voss said quietly, off the open channel, to nobody but her own bridge crew. Reyes checked a second display, cross-referencing the traffic logs they'd picked up on approach, the standard shipping lane data that came bundled with every jump space chart. There's nothing inbound on any registered vector. Nearest compact vessel is 11 hours out, and it's not on a rescue heading. It's on a routine patrol route that just happens to pass near enough to show up on the log. Whoever's answering us either doesn't know that, or they're lying because they think that's what they're supposed to say to keep an outside ship from getting involved. Voss opened the channel again, keeping her voice level, the voice she used for frightened patients and panicking crew alike. Outpost 61, I don't see any compact vessel closer than 11 hours, and your reactor doesn't have 11 hours in it. You have 51 people aboard, including children. We are docking and beginning evacuation. If your government has an issue with that, they can raise it with me directly, in person, after everyone is off that rig and somewhere safe. There was a long silence, long enough that Kofi glanced at the captain, unsure whether to send the docking request or wait. Then the same voice, quieter now, almost startled, the sound of a man reading a sentence in a language he technically knew but had never expected to actually need in his lifetime. You would spend a ship. For us. It wasn't a question. It sounded like disbelief trying to fit itself into grammar it wasn't built for. We are not spending anything yet, Voss said. Priya, get us docked, mind the clamps, that hull's not going to be forgiving. Reyes, prep triage in Bay 2. We are going to need it bigger than Bay 1, pull the folding cots from storage. Kofi, I want that reactor's failure profile the second we are inside, because I want to know how long we actually have before this decision gets made for us. She didn't look at Priya, who was already running calculations under her breath, already doing the math on fuel reserves and dock clamps and the fact that if this went wrong, the Halcyon Reach wasn't built to survive being anywhere near a reactor breach of that size. Priya did the math anyway. She said nothing about it. She just brought them in, steady hands on a ship that had never once, in her 4 years aboard, been asked to do anything like this. Inside, Outpost 6-1 smelled like scorched metal and recycled air pushed past its limit, thick enough to taste at the back of the throat. Reyes moved through the lower decks first, a scanner in one hand and a medkit slung across his back, cataloguing injuries in the clipped shorthand he used when there wasn't time for anything else. Burns, 2nd and 3rd degree, worse than the sensors from outside had suggested. Smoke inhalation, in nearly everyone he passed. A crushed leg, an elderly Vantrel woman pinned under a fallen support strut who had apparently been telling the people around her to help the children first, in the same flat, exhausted voice, for over an hour, refusing to be moved up the priority list no matter how many times someone tried. The Vantrel who met them at the airlock introduced himself as Desin, the rig's junior overseer, a narrow, grey-skinned man with vertical pupils and a voice that kept catching, like he wasn't sure yet whether any of this was real or whether he'd finally cracked under the strain of the last 6 hours and started imagining rescue. Our senior overseer is in the reactor section, Desin said, leading Reyes and 2 crewmen down a corridor that groaned under their combined weight, the deck plating flexing in a way that made Reyes' stomach tighten with every step. He would not leave. He is trying to slow the breach manually, to buy time for the evacuation, even though he told the rest of us there was no realistic chance anyone would be evacuating. Time for what? Reyes asked. You said compact ships weren't coming. Desin didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone flatter, more careful. The sound, Reyes would think later, replaying it in his head that night, of someone reciting a rule he'd never had cause to question before today, a rule so deeply worn into him that saying it out loud felt strange only now, in front of someone who clearly didn't share it. This outpost is a labor designation. 4th caste. We are not a priority routing. Rescue vessels are dispatched by value tier, and the calculation is done automatically, before anyone even has to decide it consciously. Ours is low. He said it the way a person might read out their own account balance to a stranger who'd asked, without shame and without expecting sympathy. We did not expect anyone to come. We told the children this, early on, so they would not be disappointed later, when help failed to arrive and they had already spent their hope on it. Reyes stopped walking for exactly 1 second. Then he kept moving, because there was a woman with a crushed leg 40 meters ahead of him, and this was not the time to let his face show what he was feeling about a whole civilization's arithmetic. But he filed it away. He thought about it while he worked the strut off the old woman's leg with Priya's help, using a hydraulic jack meant for engine housings, not human, not Vantrel, anatomy, easing it a centimeter at a time so the release wouldn't do more damage than the trap already had. He thought about it while a boy of maybe 8 years old, arm burned along one side, refused to cry in front of his younger sister and instead asked Reyes, with painstaking, rehearsed politeness, whether the Halcyon Reach had enough room for all of us, or only the important ones, in the exact careful tone of a child repeating something an adult had told him to say if this moment ever came. We don't sort people by important, Reyes told him, meeting his eyes and holding them, because he wanted the boy to see he meant it and wasn't just saying words to calm him down. Everyone on that rig gets a seat. You, your sister, everybody. That's not a maybe. The boy looked at him like he'd said something in a language that didn't quite translate, turned the sentence over, searching for the catch in it, and not finding one. His name, Reyes learned a few minutes later while splinting the boy's uninjured wrist just to give his hand something steady to do while the burn dressing set, was Taylai's. His sister was Merrin, 4 years younger, silent in the way children get when they've decided crying will only make the adults around them more frightened than they already are. Taylai's held very still through the whole procedure, watching Reyes's face for some sign of how bad it actually was, and Reyes made a point of keeping his expression exactly as boring and businesslike as he could manage, because he had learned a long time ago that children could read panic on a doctor's face faster than any instrument could read it on a scanner. Your ship, Taylai said eventually, testing the wrist splint with careful curiosity. Does it have a name? Halcyon Reach. What does that mean? Reyes thought about it for a second, taping off the last edge of the dressing. Halcyon means calm, peaceful. Reach means going toward something, trying to get somewhere. Taylai's considered this with the same grave seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. That is a strange name for a ship that flies into reactors. Yeah, Reyes admitted, surprising a short laugh out of himself despite everything. Yeah, it kind of is. Priya, working 2 meters away on the woman with the crushed leg, caught the exchange and didn't say anything, but something in her shoulders eased half a degree, the way a person's does when a bad hour tips, however slightly, toward a better one. Back on the bridge, Kofi ran the numbers Voss had asked for and didn't like any of them. Reactor containment's failing faster than the initial read, he said, watching a curve on his display bend in a direction he didn't want it to. Reyes's team has maybe 90 minutes before that section becomes unsurvivable, and that's optimistic. The decay rate's already accelerating past the model I built off the first scan. We can get people off in waves, but at 51, plus injuries, plus decontamination time between each shuttle run. He trailed off, doing the math a second time in case the first answer had been wrong. It wasn't. We don't have 90 minutes of real margin. We have maybe 60, if nothing else goes wrong. And something always goes wrong. Priya, monitoring the docking clamps from an auxiliary station, spoke without looking up from her own readouts. There's a data relay buoy 8,000 kilometers off our stern. Wasn't there on the approach charts we pulled before we set out. It's been matching our position since we arrived, holding the same relative bearing no matter how we maneuver. She frowned, running the signature a second time. It's not broadcasting anything I can pick up on any frequency I know how to read. Just watching. Sitting there like it's got nowhere better to be. Vantrel? Voss asked. Signature doesn't match anything in our database, compact or otherwise. Could be theirs, built to specs we haven't catalogued. Could be older than that. Could be something else's entirely. Voss filed it next to a dozen other things she didn't have time for right now. Log it, flag it, and leave it be. We'll worry about who's watching after everyone's off that rig. Kofi, get me Shuttle 1 loaded and moving. We start with the injured. She had no way of knowing, in that moment, how much that single instruction, we'll worry about who's watching after, would come to matter. The senior overseer's name was Yarrell Cassith, and when Voss finally reached him in the reactor section, he was standing in front of a containment panel with his bare hands pressed against a coolant valve that should have needed 3 people and a hydraulic tool to move, holding it shut through nothing but stubbornness and the fact that letting go meant the section flooded with radiation 30 seconds sooner than it otherwise would. You should evacuate, Voss told him, pulling on a rad suit glove before she got anywhere near the valve, keeping her voice steady even as the readout on her wrist unit climbed toward numbers she didn't like. Let my engineer handle this. You've bought us the time. Let it be enough. If I let go, the seal fails immediately. Then we'll hold it together until Priya gets here with something better than hands. Let go on 3. He looked at her, a long look, the kind that seemed to be recalculating something with every second it lasted, weighing a lifetime of assumptions against the plain fact of a stranger in a rad suit offering to take half his burden for no reason he could name, and let go on 3. Priya arrived 40 seconds later at a dead run, dragging a proper hydraulic clamp behind her, cursing steadily under her breath in a mix of 2 languages, and got the valve stable within 2 minutes of hard, sweat-drenched work. It wasn't a fix. It was a stall, the kind of stopgap that bought minutes instead of hours. But it was enough of one that the reactor's failure curve flattened, just slightly, just enough to change 60 minutes into 90. That bore us time, Priya said, breathing hard, wiping her face with the back of a glove that only smeared the sweat around. Not much. Enough to get the wounded off first, at least, before we start pushing our luck on the rest. Cassith was staring at his own hands, which had gone an unhealthy shade of grey-blue from cold and strain, flexing his fingers slowly as though checking they still belonged to him. You did not need to hold it with me, he said. I would have failed in another minute regardless, alone or not. There was no return in coming to help me specifically. I am not a person your government has any reason to know exists, let alone value. There wasn't a return in coming out here at all, Voss said. We came anyway. Yes. Cassith said it slowly, like he was trying the word on for size, turning it over the way a person handles an object from a culture they've never encountered. That is the part one do not understand. I have run trade negotiations. I have run labor disputes. Every transaction I have ever conducted, on either side of the table, began with a calculation of value. This did not. Above them, the evacuation had turned into something closer to a relay race than a rescue. Reyes ran triage with 2 crewmen and Desin, who had appointed himself translator and was proving unexpectedly good at calming frightened children in the last 90 seconds before they were strapped into an evac pod, crouching down to their eye level, keeping his voice light even when his hands, out of their sight, were shaking. Kofi coordinated shuttle runs from the bridge, recalculating fuel margins every time the reactor's failure curve shifted, watching their safety buffer shrink with each trip like sand running out of an hourglass he couldn't turn back over. By the fourth shuttle run, the math had gone from tight to bad. "Captain," Kofi said, voice careful, the kind of careful that meant he'd check the number 3 times hoping it would change. "If we run a 5th trip at current burn rate, we don't have enough reserve fuel to make the jump back to the relay station. We'd be stranded out here until a supply ship reached us. Could be weeks, depending on the traffic schedule." "How many people are still on that rig?" 11, including the 6 children. Voss didn't hesitate, and later, when Kofi told the story, because he would tell it, for years, at every posting he ever had after this one, that was the detail he came back to. Not the reactor. Not the valve. The half-second it took her to answer, and the fact that it had been half a second and not a full one. Run the 5th trip. "Captain, if something else goes wrong out here, if we are stranded past our own emergency reserves too, then we'll be stranded together instead of half of us being stranded on a rig that's about to become a crater. Run the trip, Kofi." He ran it. Before the shuttle launched, Kofi did one thing nobody had asked him to do. He pulled the ship's emergency ration allocation on his console and quietly ran it for 51 passengers instead of the 20 the Halcyon Reach was built to carry, then ran it again assuming a worst-case 11-day drift instead of the standard 4. The numbers came back tight enough to make his stomach drop. He didn't tell the captain, not yet, because there wasn't a version of the answer that would have changed what she'd just ordered him to do, and he didn't see the point in giving her one more thing to carry into the next 90 minutes. He just adjusted the water recycler cycle rate up by 6%, filed the change under routine maintenance, and went back to running the shuttle. Sin, watching from beside him with the flat, exhausted patience of a man who had stopped expecting good news several hours ago, noticed anyway. "You are changing something," he said. "I do not understand your instruments, but I understand a man doing arithmetic he does not want witnessed." "Just making sure the math still works once everyone's aboard," Kofi said. "Does it?" Kofi looked at the number on his screen a moment longer than he needed to. "It works," he said. "It's just going to be a long 11 days. Sin didn't ask anything further. He simply nodded, once, the way a person nods at information they intend to remember for a long time without saying so out loud. The 5th shuttle run should have been routine. It was not. Halfway through loading the last group, Kassith, Sin, the 8-year-old boy and his sister, and 4 workers too injured to walk unassisted, strapped into their harnesses with the particular tenderness of people handling something they know is fragile. The reactor's containment, held together for the last 90 minutes by nothing but Priya's clamp and sheer bad-tempered persistence, finally gave. It didn't explode. It was worse than that, in a slower, more surgical way, a cascading pressure failure that blew out an entire deck of the rig in a silent, violent gout of superheated gas, tearing the shuttle bay's outer door half off its housing and pinning it at an angle that made a clean launch impossible, the metal shrieking as it twisted. "We are boxed in," the shuttle pilot reported. Voice climbing toward panic, he was visibly fighting to keep out of his hands on the controls. "Doors jammed at 40 degrees, I can't get a clean vector, and radiation spiking in the bay. I'm reading levels I really don't want to sit in much longer." "Hold position," Voss said, already moving, already 3 steps toward the bridge's tactical station before the sentence finished. "Halcyon reached to shuttle 2. Do not attempt that gap, I say again, do not attempt it, you will clip the frame." She was on the bridge in 90 seconds flat, staring at a tactical display that had, in the space of 2 minutes, turned into a problem with no good answer sitting anywhere on the board. The shuttle was trapped in a bay that was about to become lethal to anyone inside it. The rig itself was starting to break apart around it, structural failures spreading outward from the reactor breach like cracks running through ice under too much weight. And the Halcyon Reach itself, still partially docked, was close enough to the rig that a full structural collapse would take them down with it if they didn't move soon. "Priya," Voss said, "can we widen that door remotely?" "Not from here, not in time. It's a mechanical jam, not an electronic one. Something's physically bent in the housing, and no override command is going to UN bend metal." "Then we go get it open manually." Priya looked at her captain the way she'd looked at exactly 2 decisions in 4 years of service together, the ones where she disagreed enough to say so out loud, and did it anyway because there wasn't time left to argue the point properly. That means someone's outside the ship, in a structure that's actively failing, standing right next to a reactor breach. Yes. I'll go. No, Voss said. You're the only one who can fly this ship out of the blast radius if it comes to that, and you're the only one who can read that housing well enough to know what's actually jamming it. I'll go. It was Reyes who ended the argument, already halfway into an EVA suit, voice flat and final in the way it only got when he'd decided something wasn't up for a vote and everyone else could catch up to that fact or not. I'm already suited from triage. I'm going. Neither of you is expendable and neither am I, so let's stop pretending this is a debate we have time for and start moving before that gap closes for good. Nobody stopped him. There wasn't time to, and there wasn't, if any of them were honest, a better answer sitting anywhere in the room. Reyes went out through the Halcyon Reach's emergency airlock with a cutting torch, a length of tow cable, and the particular, focused calm of a man who had decided fear was a luxury he'd deal with afterward, assuming there was an afterward to deal with it in. The rig shuttle bay door hung at a crooked, half-torn angle, backlit by the sickly orange glow of the breach venting somewhere behind it, throwing long, shifting shadows across the twisted frame. Reyes clipped the tow cable to the door's warp housing with hands that only shook a little, a fact he noted with some professional detachment, the way he'd note a patient's vitals, then keyed his comm. Priya, I need you to take up slack on this cable the second I clear the housing. Nice and slow. If you yank it, you'll tear the whole frame off and crush the shuttle instead of freeing it, and then this whole exercise was for nothing. Copy that. Standing by, slow and steady, you have my word. He went to work with the torch on the section of housing that had bent inward and jammed the mechanism, aware, in the distant, unhelpful way a person is aware of things they can't afford to think about right now, that every second he spent out here was a second closer to a second, larger failure in a structure that was actively coming apart around him piece by piece. A support strut groaned somewhere above his head and shifted 6 centimeters with a shriek of tortured metal. He didn't look up. Looking up wouldn't help him cut faster, and it would only give his imagination something worse to work with. Cutting through now, he said, sparks scattering across his visor in a shower he'd stopped flinching from 3 seconds in. Priya, on my mark. The torch bit through the last of the warp housing. The door gave, all at once, swinging free on its remaining hinge with a groan that Reyes felt through his boots more than heard. Mark. Priya took up the slack exactly as instructed, slow, steady, no jerks, the tow cable drawing taut with the patient precision of someone who had done difficult, careful things with her hands her whole career, and the door swung the rest of the way open, clearing just enough space for the shuttle to thread through the gap with room to spare, but only just. Inside, the pilot didn't wait to be told twice. The shuttle shot free of the bay in a burst of maneuvering thrusters, clearing the rig's collapsing structure with less than 4 seconds to spare before the section behind it folded in on itself entirely, deck plating crumpling like paper in a fist. Reyes was still outside. Reyes, get back to the airlock, now, Voss said, already watching the rig's structural integrity readout collapse toward 0 across its remaining sections, one after another, in a cascade she couldn't stop. That whole platform is coming apart underneath you. Copy, he said, and started moving, boots finding purchase on a hull that was shuddering harder with every passing second, and that was when a secondary strut, knocked loose by the same collapse that had freed the shuttle, swung down out of the dark without warning and caught him across the shoulder, spinning him off his tether line into open space, the stars wheeling once, twice, in his visor before he could get his bearings back. For 11 seconds, nobody on the Halcyon Reach said anything at all. Then Priya, without waiting for an order, without asking permission, brought the ship itself around on maneuvering thrusters, close, far closer than any safety protocol would have sanctioned, close enough that the rig's final collapse threw debris rattling across their outer hull like hail on a tin roof, and put the Halcyon Reach directly between Reyes and the widening field of wreckage, using their own ship as a shield while Kofi, leaning half out of an access hatch with a tether gun, fired. A line and reeled Omar Reyes in like a man pulling a friend out of a river before the current could take him somewhere none of them could follow. Behind them, Outpost 6-1 finished coming apart, silent and total, exactly the way Casseth had said it would. 51 people were already clear. Reyes came aboard bruised, furious at himself for the mistake that had nearly cost him, and alive. They limped away from the wreck field on one working engine, fuel reserves gone, hull scarred along one whole flank from debris strikes that had left long, pale gouges across the plating, with 51 Vantrel refugees packed into a ship rated for maybe 20, sitting shoulder to shoulder in corridors never meant to hold more than one person passing through at a time. Nobody complained. Not about the crowding, not about the rationed water, not about the 11-day drift they now faced before a supply ship could reach them with enough fuel to make the jump home. Cassith found Voss on the observation deck 2 days into the drift, watching the stars with the specific, hollow-eyed stillness of a captain doing the math on everything that had almost gone wrong, and everything that still could. "I have been trying to understand something," he said, easing himself down into the seat beside her with the careful movements of someone still recovering from 2 days of manual labor his body wasn't built for, "and I find I cannot, not without asking you directly." "Ask." "You have stranded your ship, endangered your crew, spent resources you cannot easily replace, on a route that will now take you weeks longer to complete than planned. For people who hold no value to your government, your economy, your political position, for people who, by every calculation my own government would run before dispatching so much as a single message drone, were not worth the cost of the fuel it took to reach them, let alone the fuel it took to save the last of us." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "I do not say this to diminish what you did. I say it because I genuinely do not understand the arithmetic, and I have spent 40 years of my life becoming very good at arithmetic." Voss thought about it for a long moment before she answered, because it deserved an honest answer, not a quick one delivered just to fill the silence. "There isn't arithmetic," she said finally. "That's the part you're missing. We didn't run a cost projection before we changed course. Somebody heard a distress call, and the answer was already yes before anyone did the math. The math came after, Priya running fuel numbers, Kofi calculating margins, me deciding how many trips we could risk, but that was about how to help, not whether to." "That seems," Cassith said slowly, "like an extraordinarily dangerous way to run a civilization. A decision made before the numbers are known cannot, by definition, be a good decision. It can only be a lucky one." "Probably," Voss agreed, allowing herself something close to a tired smile. "Ask me again in 9 days, once we are actually home and I'm filling out the report explaining why we are 2 weeks behind schedule and short one engine, and I might even agree with you." Cassith didn't say anything else for a while. He stood beside her, looking at the same stretch of stars, turning something over in his mind that Voss couldn't see and wouldn't understand the full weight of for quite some time yet, a lifetime of learned caution running headlong into a data point it had no category for. 3 days later, with water rationed to a careful trickle and the recycler running hot enough that Priya checked its seals twice a shift, Taylor found his way to the observation deck too, small and quiet, and set a careful distance from the captain without being invited, the way children do when they've decided a place is safe but aren't yet sure they're welcome in it. "Merrin is asleep," he said, by way of explanation, when Voss glanced over. "Dessin says I am supposed to be asleep also. I am not tired." "Neither am I," Voss admitted. They sat in silence for a while, watching the same unfamiliar stretch of stars neither of them had a name for. Eventually Taylor spoke again, in the careful, testing voice of a question he'd clearly been turning over for some time before deciding it was safe to ask out loud. "On the rig," he said, "Dessin told us the ships that come for people are graded. That there are ships for important people, and no ships for us. Is that also true where you are from?" Voss considered lying to make it simpler, and decided against it, because Taylor's had already survived one thing today that most children never had to, and he'd earned a real answer. "We grade a lot of things we shouldn't," she said. "But not this. Not who gets a rescue ship. Once the call goes out, that part's not supposed to be a question at all." "Supposed to be," Taylor's repeated, catching the qualifier the way sharp children do. "People don't always live up to what they're supposed to do," Voss said. "But we try. And when a ship's crew decides not to try, that's on them, not on some rule that says you weren't worth the fuel. Nobody gets to write that rule about you. Not on my ship." Taylor's thought about that for a long moment, turning it over with the same grave seriousness he'd given the ship's name 3 days earlier, and then, apparently satisfied, he curled up in the observation seat and, despite his earlier insistence otherwise, fell asleep within 10 minutes, leaving Voss alone again with the stars and the quiet, steady hum of a ship carrying more than twice the people it was built for, holding together anyway. What neither Voss nor Cassith knew, what nobody aboard the Halcyon Reach would learn for another 6 weeks, was that every second of the rescue had been recorded, catalogued, and transmitted in real time to a listening post far outside sensor range, by the relay boy that had been waiting in that debris field for exactly this kind of test. Overseer Cale Rentiers had run the Outpost 6-1 scenario 11 times before, on 11 different candidate species being quietly evaluated for potential contact along the Compact's expanding frontier, each iteration adjusted slightly to control for variables he'd catalogued with the same precision he brought to everything else in his career. He had run it on 3 separate occasions specifically involving humans, staging smaller failures, smaller stakes, watching how they responded when the cost was low and the value of the people at risk was, by any reasonable measure, negligible enough that walking away carried no real consequence. 11 times, the pattern had held steady enough to build a model on. Species weighed the cost. Species calculated the political value of the people at risk before committing resources. Species that were not already allies, not already owed something by prior treaty, generally did not spend real resources on strangers who could offer nothing in return. It was not cruelty, in his considered professional judgment. It was simply how threat assessment worked, how any rational actor allocated finite resources under uncertainty. His own government ran on the same logic, layer upon layer of caste and value tier, and it had kept the Compact stable and expanding for longer than human civilization had existed in any organized, recorded form. He had built his entire career on the reliability of that logic. He had never once had cause to doubt it. He had not expected, this 12th iteration, either a repeat of the pattern, a human ship that hailed the rig, assessed the risk, and reported the incident to Compact authorities without engaging directly, which was the response his model rated as most likely, or, at most, a limited, cautious rescue that stopped well short of real sacrifice, which was the second most likely outcome and the one he'd privately expected given the humans' documented history of small-scale relief operations. Elsewhere in the sector, he had not expected a captain to order a 5th shuttle run with insufficient fuel reserves to guarantee her own crew's safe return, weighing that decision, by his own careful review of the recording, in less than a second. He had not expected a physician to walk outside a failing structure with a torch and a cable, into the direct path of a reactor breach, for a stranger with a crushed leg and a value tier so low that Renthus's own database didn't bother tracking it as a distinct category, filing it instead under an aggregate labeled simply labor, unranked. He had not expected an engineer to bring an unarmed relief vessel directly into a debris field, at a range that violated every safety principle her own training would have taught her, to shield one man from wreckage, one man, out of 51, already vastly outweighing the resources spent to save him by any calculation Renthis knew how to run. Renthis watched the footage a second time. Then a third, pausing on the 11 seconds of silence after the physician went spinning free of his tether, studying the bridge crew's faces frame by frame, looking for the calculation he was certain must be hiding somewhere in their expressions. He did not find it. He found only fear, and then motion, arriving together with no visible gap between them. His aide, a younger officer named Sethes who had never run a field evaluation before and had spent the last 2 hours growing steadily more unsettled watching his superior's certainty come apart in real time, stood at his shoulder with the growing discomfort of someone present for something they suspected they'd be asked about later, by people whose questions he did not yet have answers for. "Sir," Sethes said carefully. The model predicted a partial response, escalating to full withdrawal once resource costs exceeded projected return. "This is..." He searched for the correct word and settled, after a moment, on the honest one, since none of the technical terms in his training seemed to apply. "This is not that." "No," Renthis said. "It is not. Do we revise the threat classification, sir? If they will commit unlimited resources to strangers with zero strategic value, that could indicate a species with no functional cost-benefit constraint on military engagement either. Logically, an actor with no ceiling on peaceful expenditure may also have no ceiling on hostile expenditure. That would make them significantly more dangerous than our current models suggest, and the Council will want that flagged immediately." Renthis said nothing for a long moment, still watching the frozen frame of the human physician being reeled back aboard his ship, alive, by a young officer leaning half his body out of an open hatch into vacuum with no hesitation Renthis could find anywhere in the recording, no matter how many times he ran it back. "Perhaps," Renthis said finally. "Or perhaps it means the opposite, and we have simply never had cause to distinguish the two before now. A species with no functional cost-benefit constraint on helping strangers is not necessarily the same as a species with no constraint on harming them. We assumed those were the same trait, because in our own history, and in the history of every other species we have catalogued, they always have been. The two who spend without counting the cost, and the two who take without counting the cost, have always turned out to be the same kind of actor, in every case on record. This may be the first exception. Or it may not be. I do not yet know, and I would rather say so plainly than guess and be believed." He straightened, and something in his posture had changed, subtly, in the way of a man recalculating a number he had trusted for a very long time and finding, for the first time in his career, that it no longer held. Log the full dataset, Rentiz said. Flag it for Compact Council review, priority designation, and attach my personal note that the standard threat escalation template does not apply cleanly here. I want that on record before anyone downstream tries to force this into a category it doesn't fit. And revise the standing threat assessment on the human sector. Not upward. Sideways. We do not yet have a category for what we just observed, and until we do, I would rather be uncertain than confidently wrong. The council session, when it convened 4 days later, was not kind to him. Councillor Odril Vash, who had built her reputation on the doctrine that had governed compact expansion for 2 generations, watched the footage once, in full, without comment, and then addressed Rentiz with the particular coldness reserved for subordinates who have made her job harder. You are proposing, she said, that we discard a threat framework which has correctly predicted the behavior of every species we have ever catalogued, on the strength of one incident, involving a Labour outpost no one in this chamber had heard of until 3 weeks ago. I am proposing we do not discard it, Rentiz said. I am proposing we acknowledge it did not predict this outcome, and that pretending otherwise serves no one. The alternative is to force the data to fit the model instead of revising the model to fit the data. I have seen where that leads in other departments, Councillor. It does not end well for the department, and it does not end well for the council that trusted its reports. And if this is a deception? Vash pressed. A performance, staged for our benefit, precisely because they suspected they were being observed. Then it was performed with 51 live witnesses, 6 of them children, at genuine and verifiable cost to their own ship and crew, days before they had any confirmation an audience existed to perform for. Rentiz let that sit for a moment before continuing, keeping his voice level, the voice he used when he most needed to be believed. I have run deception scenarios for 11 years, Councillor. I know what a performance costs a species that stages one, and I know what it costs one that means it. These are not the same number, and the difference is not subtle once you know where to look. Vash said nothing further for a long moment, studying him with an expression Rentiz couldn't fully read. Not agreement, not yet, but something that had stopped being simple dismissal. Sideways, then, she said finally, echoing his own recommendation back at him with evident distaste for the word. Not upward. For now. But I want continued observation, Rentiz, and I want it run by someone who has not already decided what he believes he saw. Understood, Councillor. He did not argue the last part, though privately he suspected no observer, however carefully selected, would watch those 11 seconds of silence and stillness and then sudden, unhesitating motion, and come away believing anything else. The Halcyon Reach limped back into the relay station 11 days later, exactly as promised, on the last dregs of a fuel reserve that had never had any business getting them home and had somehow, through Priya's stubborn, unglamorous engineering, done it anyway. Elena Voss expected paperwork. She expected a formal complaint from the Compact, possibly a diplomatic incident over an unauthorized rescue in contested space, possibly nothing at all. The Vantrel had never shown much interest in acknowledging human actions one way or the other, and 4 years of near silence had taught her not to expect otherwise. What she got, 3 weeks later, was an encrypted transmission on a frequency that took Kofi 2 full days to even confirm was genuine, requesting, not demanding, requesting, in language stiff with the particular discomfort of a government trying out a diplomatic register it had never needed before and wasn't entirely sure how to hold, a formal meeting between Compact representatives and human authorities, at a neutral station, to discuss what the transmission called, without further explanation, an unresolved gap in mutual threat modeling. Cassith, who had stayed aboard as an informal liaison at Dessen's insistence and his own government's quiet, unofficial approval, read the transmission twice before he started laughing. A short, disbelieving sound Voss had never once heard him make in 11 days of drift and 3 weeks of paperwork since. You have no idea what this is, he said. Enlighten me. My government has spent 3 generations building policy around the assumption that any species not already bound to us by treaty or debt operates on predictable, self-interested logic. It is the foundation beneath everything. Trade routes, border postures, contact protocols with new species, the entire caste architecture that governs how we allocate every resource we have. You have just handed them evidence that at least one species does not reliably follow that logic, and they do not know whether that makes you safer to approach, or considerably more dangerous, and the not knowing is, I promise you, causing a great deal of quiet panic in rooms you will never see. Which do you think it makes us? Cassith considered the question with the same careful weight he'd given every question since the rescue, the habit of a man who had learned, over 11 days of drift, that the honest answer usually took a little longer to find than the easy one, and was worth the wait. I think, he said slowly, that a government which spends without counting the cost to save strangers is not the same as one that spends without counting the cost to take from them. I said something close to this to my own overseer. Before I understood, I was quoting your overseer Renthus's own report back to him without ever having read it myself. He shook his head, something almost fond in the gesture. I think my government is going to spend a very long time trying to build a model that accounts for people who help first and calculate afterward. I do not think they will ever fully manage it. I have come, over these past weeks, to believe that is not a bad thing. I did not expect to believe that when this began. Voss thought about the boy on the rig, the one who'd asked, with such careful, rehearsed politeness, whether there was room for all of them or only the important ones. She thought about Reyes's answer, given without a half-second of hesitation, the kind of answer that hadn't needed to be planned because it had never really been a question in the first place. Tell your people, she said, that they don't need a model. They just need to ask the question honestly and see what we do. We are not that complicated. We never were. No, Cassith agreed. I am beginning to understand that you are not complicated at all. You are simply willing to pay a price my people have spent centuries learning never to pay, because paying it without a guarantee of return was, in every case we had ever recorded before yours, a mistake. I do not yet know what to call what you are instead. He paused. For now, I am calling it fortunate. For all of us, on both sides of a border I suspect is about to change shape. Voss thought about the meeting she'd have to attend now, the diplomats and translators and careful, watchful eyes on both sides of a table that had never before had a reason to exist. What do I tell your council when they ask me the same question you just asked me? Because they will ask it. You said so yourself. Tell them the truth, Cassith said. It will unsettle them considerably more than a clever answer would. My people are prepared for cleverness. We are not prepared for a species that simply means what it says, plainly, without a second layer underneath it to negotiate from. That is, I suspect, going to be the hardest part of this for everyone at that table who is not you. And the easiest part. Cassith considered this, and for the first time since the rescue, something that might have been genuine warmth crossed his face instead of careful calculation. The easiest part, he said, will be Taylor's insisting on being present for at least one session, so he can tell your overseer Rentis in person that your ship's name means calm and reaching, and that he does not think it is such a strange name after all, now that he has had time to consider it. Voss laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks that didn't have exhaustion sitting underneath it. I'll hold him to that. 6 months later, Kofi Boateng stood in a small chapel on Earth, in a suit that didn't quite fit right across the shoulders, and watched his sister get married exactly on schedule, exactly the way he'd promised her he would be there for, in writing, twice. He hadn't told her the whole story yet. He would, eventually. The reactor, the shuttle bay, the 11 seconds of silence on the bridge when Omar Reyes went spinning off his tether into open space and nobody had said a word before Priya had already started moving the ship. For now, he just watched his sister dance with her new husband under lights strung across a garden that had nothing to do with reactors or debris fields or fuel margins, and thought, with a strange, quiet clarity that only comes afterward, about how close he'd come to missing it, and how little he'd actually thought about that cost in the moment it mattered most. Overseer Cale Rentis, half a galaxy away, filed the final version of his report to the Compact Council under a new classification header his own government had never needed before, one his aide had proposed after weeks of internal argument, and he had, after considerable reflection, approved over the objections of 2 senior colleagues, unpredictable, non-hostile. It was an uncomfortable category. It did not fit neatly beside any of the others in a system built entirely around things fitting neatly. He suspected it would remain uncomfortable for a very long time, as his people slowly, carefully, revised 3 generations of doctrine around a single, stubborn fact his models had never accounted for and, he was beginning to suspect, never could. He kept the footage from Outpost 6-1 in his personal archive long after the official report was filed and the council had moved on to arguing about its implications in rooms he was no longer invited into. Not the tactical data, not the fuel calculations, but the 11 seconds where a ship full of strangers had gone quiet and then acted, all at once, without a vote, without a debate, without anyone stopping to ask whether one man was worth the risk before deciding he was. He watched it more than once, in the years that followed, whenever his own government's caution began to feel, to him, less like wisdom and more like a wall built so high nobody inside it could remember what it had originally been built to keep out. He never did find the right word for what he'd seen. But he stopped needing one. Some things, he had come to understand, were not made smaller by being difficult to name. They were simply true, the way a rescue crew's answer had been true before anyone aboard the Halcyon Reach had bothered to count the cost of giving it. By the time the Compact finally understood what they had actually witnessed at Outpost 6-1, the report had already changed everything that mattered between two civilizations that had, until then, agreed only to stay out of each other's way. Not because humanity had proven itself dangerous. Because it had proven itself, in the one way no threat model had ever been built to survive, entirely predictable, and entirely unwilling to leave anyone behind. _______________________________________________________________________________________________